Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Professor Hamamoto. The date is August 27, year 2021, 5:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Many of you are acquainted with the work of Philip K. Dick. His short stories and novels have been adapted to multi-part series and feature films. Perhaps the best-known adaptation is the film Blade Runner, directed by Ridley Scott. For the last several years, I've been researching the life of the writer Philip Dick. One of the more revealing aspects of his life was that his mother enrolled him in a child psychology observational program. Dick remained in that program until age 18, whereupon he was able to sign himself out of the program. Glimpses into this aspect of his life are provided by Tessa B. Dick, who authored a fascinating autobiography titled My Life on the Edge of Reality, a Memoir, published in 2011. I'll be reading an excerpt from this excellent autobiography, which alludes to these crucial years in the life of Philip Dick. I hope that you enjoy this reading and learn from it, just as I have. Thank you very much. Part 2, Chapter 1, Fate Steps In. I say that fate stepped in because that was how I thought of it at the time. I had convinced myself that after God created the universe and set it in motion, he stepped back and let it run on its own. Looking back, I believe that while I was planning my permanent escape from my dysfunctional family, God had another plan for me. On July 1st, the first Saturday morning in July 1972, I had gone swimming at the community pool because we were in the middle of a terrible heat wave and I needed some relief. I say that I went swimming, but it was more like wading. I still feared the deep end of the swimming pool. I went home and showered off, and when I came out of the bathroom, Mom was on the phone with her friend Ginger. I heard Mom repeating the word no, and then she asked me if I would like to go to a beach party. I said okay. Ginger used to drive the school bus at Colonial Academy, so I knew who she was, but I didn't know her very well. Anyway, she came and picked me up, and she drove me to my fate. At that party, I met a little-known science fiction writer named Philip K. Dick, went home with him that night, and eventually married him. At first, Phil thought that I had been sent to spy on him, and perhaps to entrap him and get him arrested for some kind of crime. Considering my experience in the research study and the secret school, perhaps he was right. Although I was not consciously aware of any such thing, I might have been programmed to act as the agent of an organization that meant to harm him. Phil often talked about The Manchurian Candidate, a movie from the early 1960s that had been pulled off the market after the assassination of President Kennedy. Home video did not exist yet, and it wasn't played in theaters or on television. Phil had seen that movie, in which a war veteran is tortured, hypnotized, and programmed to kill on command. He carries a deck of cards in his pocket, and his mother tells him to play solitaire when he feels nervous. He carries out his orders when he sees the Queen of Diamonds. When he is ordered to shoot a presidential candidate, he instead kills his torturers, including his own mother. I enjoyed playing solitaire, but Phil threw a fit and would not allow a deck of cards in the house. Phil had been terrorized and driven out of his home in San Rafael, California, just a few months before I met him. I felt that I had been driven out of my home by my dysfunctional family. There were some interesting parallels between our recent experiences. In fact, while I was suffering a high fever at home in Brea and hoping that I would die because I was in so much pain, Phil had been trying to kill himself with sleeping pills in a hotel room in Canada. Phil was certain that he had been subjected to mind control. He had been a subject in a longitudinal study of gifted children. His mother signed him up for the study, but Phil opted out when he turned 18. In addition, a man that he met in San Rafael told him that a secret organization was planning to use him as an agent. And while he was in Vancouver, British Columbia, Phil was kidnapped by mysterious men in black suits. They drove him around the city for several hours and talked to him, but he couldn't remember anything that they said. Phil had a habit that he referred to as serial marriage. He was barely 18 when he married Jeanette against his mother's wishes, but they broke up after a few months. Phil said that he had two reasons for divorcing her. First, her brother disapproved of his record collection, which consisted of classical music albums. Second, Jeanette announced that she wanted to date other men. Then he met Cleo and married her, but their marriage lasted only a few years. When Anne came to introduce herself to the young writer who had recently moved into her community, she stole his heart away. Phil left Cleo for Anne, a young widow with two daughters. Anne soon gave birth to Phil's daughter Laura, but that marriage didn't last either. The end was near when a young girl named Nancy came to visit. Nancy's stepmother was secretary to James Pike, the Episcopal Bishop of California, and Phil was a conscientious member of the Episcopal Church. Phil left Anne and married Nancy, and they had a daughter, Isolde. That marriage ended when Nancy left Phil, taking their baby daughter with her. I learned all of this over a period of several years in bits and pieces, while Phil repeatedly discussed the vandalism of his house that happened on November 17, 1971, with anybody who would listen. In his search for answers, Phil developed and discarded many theories of who had done it and why, but the fact remained that someone had broken into his house and stolen some of his manuscripts and financial records, tossed food all over the kitchen floor, and totally ignored money and other valuables that were sitting out in plain sight. I met two people who had seen that house shortly after the break-in. It might have been extreme right-wingers, the Black Panthers, federal narcotics agents, the local police, drug addicts, drug dealers, or members of a government-sponsored organization so secret that even the FBI and the CIA didn't know about it. A man named Hal Kinchen had told Phil that he belonged to just such an organization and that they wanted to recruit Phil to work for them. As an author, Phil could travel all over the world without arousing suspicion, so he would make an excellent courier. They would make sure that he always had plenty of money, which probably appealed to an obscure pulp writer living in poverty. If he refused, Hal said, they could always kill him and replace him with a look-alike. Sometimes Phil speculated that he really was a look-alike and that the real Philip K. Dick had died in Canada after all. I seriously doubt it. Among the many discussions of the events that had driven Phil to flee his home, he began to talk about the harm that illegal drugs had done to many of the people he knew and cared about. He viewed them as children who went out to play, but the toys they chose were deadly. As humans, we are born with a desire to alter our minds, to explore the vast universe within ourselves, as well as to venture into the wilderness, the ocean, or space. When we use chemical substances, however, we court brain damage and death. Heroin addiction was rampant in the early 1970s, and addicts would sell everything they had, plus everything you had, to get one more fix. Cocaine was still the drug of choice for wealthy people. It cost way too much money for the average person to buy it. Marijuana was nothing like what you see today. It came in a bulging baggie for $10 or $20, and it took at least half of it to get you high. All it ever did for me was make me hungry. I can admit to that now, because I was 17 years old when I smoked pot in 1971, so I was a minor and the statute of limitation has long since passed. Even so, the penalty for marijuana possession was the same as if you had a bag of heroin. The seeds of a story began to germinate, and Phil began work on his second novel, A Scanner Darkly, in which an undercover narcotics agent gets hooked on drugs. When he is ordered to spy on himself, he is so brain damaged from the drugs that he doesn't realize that he is both the police officer and the suspect. Phil began discussing the story for hours on end without writing down a single word. He dreamed about the story, and he spent most of his waking hours discussing the plot and the people who would inhabit the imaginary world of A Scanner Darkly. I had very little experience with drugs, but I had known a few addicts, so I was able to contribute a few things. After he had the entire story worked out in his mind, Phil sat down at the typewriter and spent between 2 and 3 weeks in a frenzy. From time to time, he would bring 2 or 3 pages out to me for proofreading. I took him snacks and coffee every hour or so. It was hard to get him to take a break for dinner. Moreover, he would often get up in the middle of the night and do more typing. I took many naps on the living room sofa because I couldn't keep up that pace. When the manuscript was finished, he mailed it off to his agent for submission to Doubleday, the hardcover house that published most of his books. But that was only the rough draft. The finished manuscript occupied most of our time for the next 2 years. He began to suffer acid reflux, and sometimes his stomach contents would come up while he was sleeping. He slept on his back, so he would wake up choking and run to the bathroom to get a cup of water. These incidents frightened us terribly, but we didn't realize that they were only a symptom of a more serious condition. Phil knew that he had a pyloric ulcer several years earlier, and he thought that was the cause of his stomach contents coming up. He also suffered an attack of pancreatitis that had nearly killed him. At the time, he blamed it on some drugs that Nancy's brother had sold him, but it is more likely that he had a congenital condition, since 2 of his children have had the same problem and they do not use drugs. One time, Phil suffered a gallbladder attack after we had eaten at a local restaurant, and Phil thought that he might have eaten bad mushrooms. He called the Poison Control Center, and then we rushed to the emergency room. It turned out that he had gallstones, so the mushrooms were not to blame. One evening, a student from Cal State Fullerton came over to interview Phil for her master's thesis, and Phil got upset when he learned that I had invited my father to dinner at the same time. I told him that it would work out fine, and it did. Nita Petrunio ended up marrying my father, who was recently divorced. Nita was also recently divorced because she had been caught having an affair with one of her professors, Dr. McNelly. Her master's thesis had been widely distributed by people who have no idea who she is. Chapter 2. Bizarre Experiences. Phil knew the girls who used to live in our apartment, since he had rented a room in the apartment next door to them for a month or two before they moved out. This part of Fullerton, California, was a bedroom community where many students from Cal State Fullerton rented apartments. The 3 girls visited us from time to time. They were convinced that our apartment was haunted, and they had even conducted an exorcism in an attempt to get rid of the demons. While they were sitting around the kitchen table and reading the ritual, the chandelier fell from the ceiling and landed on the table. Phil said that they didn't do it right, since an exorcism should be done on a person, not on a building. At least one of the girls was a drug addict. We began finding things moved while we were not home, and that spooked us at first. But then one of the girls admitted, under pressure from Phil, that she had kept a key to the apartment and had been letting herself in while we were out. She left through a window when she heard us coming up the stairs. We got the lock changed, something that should have been done before we moved in. However, that did not explain the swampy atmosphere of our bedroom. It always seemed dark, humid, and stuffy. The other bedroom, which was next to it and had a window on the same wall, seemed bright and cheery. We moved into the other bedroom when we realized that it was so different. I began having nightmares in which my mother was beating me, and finally, in one of the dreams, I hit her back. In fact, I was actually hitting and kicking Phil, so we got up and made a pot of coffee. We had visitors almost every day, and Tim Powers usually stayed for dinner. Tim was a student at Cal State, and he used to draw on our napkins with a black felt pen. I thought that he was going to be an artist, but instead he became a writer. Tim's poverty was at least as bad as ours. His shirts were frayed, and the sleeves often had holes at the elbows. He is doing very well now, since Disney has bought the rights to his novel On Stranger Tides for their Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. Phil spent hours talking with Tim, usually about the disturbing rise of neo-Nazism in both North and South America. They speculated about the cause of Hitler's madness and the insane scientific experiments that took place in Nazi Germany. Phil had been trying for a decade to write the sequel to his novel, The Man in the High Castle, but he never did write it. That alternate history presented a world in which the Axis won World War II. The first novel explored the Japanese occupation of the west coast of the United States, and the sequel would have explored the German occupation of the East Coast. One morning, an FBI agent came to the door. Phil told me to stay in the bedroom with the door shut, which I did, so I didn't hear any of their conversation. Phil said that it was about his experience in Canada, where he had been kidnapped, as well as the hit on his house in 1971. We made 2 trips away from home, one to attend the 1972 World Science Fiction Convention in Los Angeles, and the other to get Phil's final divorce decree from Nancy at a courthouse in Marin County. Both trips wore me out, but Phil seemed energized. He slept only 6 hours a night, and his sleep was often interrupted by bad dreams. I had traveled exactly twice before then, once to Stanford University to apply for admission, and once to Mexicali for a day trip with family friends. I never had been to a science fiction convention or any kind of convention before. We didn't have a car, and I didn't know how to drive, so we walked to the grocery store nearly every day. Phil, who had spent most of his life in Northern California, was struck by the sight of pines and palm trees growing side by side, as well as the Roman architectural style of the local post office. Actually, it was Spanish mission style, but I didn't argue the point, since the difference is insignificant. We also saw many deodar trees, a type of cedar. In his mind, the pine trees symbolized the Celtic tribes of ancient Europe, while the palm trees represented the Roman conquerors. The cedars, of course, brought to mind the cedars of Lebanon, which were used in the construction of Solomon's temple. Phil was deeply religious, although he did not attend church. In fact, he found it difficult to go anywhere because his phobias were growing more intense as time went on. He had always suffered from a variety of phobias, but there were times when he could function in spite of them. His agoraphobia eventually became so bad that he couldn't leave the apartment, and sometimes he couldn't leave the bedroom. And then there were his bouts with what he called the flu, which were probably the symptoms of chronic pancreatitis. In April, Phil bought me a used car, but it was really for him, since I didn't have a driver's license. The old Dodge Coronet 500 was silver with black vinyl hardtop, a 450 V8 engine, and air conditioning. Most cars of that era did not have air conditioning. We got married on April 18, 1973, in our living room by a minister who came to the apartment for a fee of $50. We had 2 witnesses present, my father and our neighbor, Isla Ray Howard. After the ceremony, Dad took us all to dinner at a fancy restaurant. This brings us to the conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, of the excerpt read from the autobiography of Tessa B. Dick, and I hope to be posting future readings from this book as well. A fascinating autobiography that I hope you will purchase and read from cover to cover. Thank you very much. I'll be back with you soon.